Let me introduce the panelists. On my right, but not necessarily, but is a good friend of mine, Terry Glavin. Terry Glavin is an author, journalist. He's worked as a reporter, a columnist, editor. He's written for a variety of newspapers, the Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail. He's written articles for a variety of different magazines. He's written several books, one of which is for sale outside the lobby, and which he'll be happy to autograph for you. He teaches at the University of British Columbia in creative writing. He's a co-founder of the Canada-Afghanistan Committee, and he's written 6 books, and a very good personal friend. I'm delighted that Terry is here in this panel. John Robson is a local hero. I mean, just a local treat. I don't know about you, but I just can't wait to Friday mornings to read his column in The Citizen, and listening to John on CFRA is just a delight. John is the managing editor of the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, which is an important new think tank here in Ottawa. He's an invited professor at the University of Ottawa. As I said, a columnist with the Ottawa Citizen. He's frequently on CFRA here in Ottawa. And he's got a PhD in American history from the University of Texas at Austin. So he's a very, very hard man to argue with. So I'm really, really delighted that John can make it here as well. But yesterday we had Ezra Levant here, and Ezra was the founder of the Western Standard magazine. And I used to read the Western Standard religiously. I loved it. And every 2 weeks the magazine would come in, and there was a section of the magazine where there's sort of a debate that went on between Michael Korn and Karen Selleck. And I really didn't know who Karen Selleck was, but I just know that every time she wrote something, I agreed with her. And I've had the privilege to meet her in the last couple of years, and I was absolutely delighted. Then when I asked her to join the panel, she agreed. Karen Selleck is the litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. She's been a lawyer in private practice for 24 years. She writes from a libertarian perspective, which is why she's on the panel. And she's been published in various newspapers, magazines since 1988. Thank you, Karen, for joining the panel. Lastly, Joseph Benamy is another person I've really been very privileged to know and work with over the last couple of years here in Ottawa. Joseph runs the Canadian Centre for Policy Studies, a very important think tank here in Ottawa, and he puts on seminars that are just an absolute must-attend. His last one on immigration reform was just tremendous. And a few weeks ago he put on a tribute dinner to Ezra Levant with Mark Stein. That was absolutely amazing. He's worked for Stephen Harper, he's worked for Stockwell Day, he's worked for the Vinay Brith, and every time Joseph writes something, it's very important for you to read. So I'm delighted that Joseph Benamy has joined the panel as well. So we'll start off with Joseph, and everybody will get 2 or 3 minutes to talk either about the film or about conservatism, and then we'll sort of see what happens. Joseph.
Thank you very much, Fred. Do I have to turn this on?
No.
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me back there? Oh, it's not that big. Good.
Closer. Just get close to the microphone and you'll be fine.
Stay close to the microphone. There we go. I apologize, by the way. I have to start with an apology because I'm still fighting off this lingering cold. I promise for those of you who have been around me, I'm not contagious anymore. It's really more just my throat is a little irritated from time to time, and I'm not quite 100% up to full strength. Listen, I just want to take a second. I'm assuming we're not going to be really strict. Nobody's going to turn my microphone off, right? Okay, good. So I have time then to say how much, and I think I can speak for all the panelists here when I talk about how much we admire and appreciate the work, Fred, that you're doing, and around not just this film festival, which was, I think, a brilliant and wonderful idea, and it's the attendance I can see is great, and I hear it's been fantastic for the whole weekend, but just the Free Thinking Film Society, having the opportunity to to come on a regular basis, usually monthly, to hear interesting speakers and see films that you're just not going to see anywhere else. If you're from Ottawa, you have to make sure you're on the mailing list, because this is one of the regular events that you have to do. You're not going to see this kind of stuff anywhere else, and it's well worth it. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
I won't speak for very long. I think the value of this is having a good interaction between ourselves and the audience as well, members of the audience as well. And I guess what I would do is I would start off by saying that if you want to have a one or two sentence concise definition of what it means to be a conservative, then you're going to be disappointed, I think, because it's actually a very difficult term to define precisely. And that's surprising to a lot of people who, if you're like me, who grew up here, you were fed a diet over the years, a steady diet of invective towards conservatism and conservatives, portraying them as being deeply and inflexibly ideological and steeped in ignorance. And that seems to be sort of the portrayal that's out there in the public realm. And in fact, one of the defining, it's not fair, because one of the defining characteristics of conservatism is that, and it's one that definitely contributes to its difficulty in defining, is that it's decidedly unideological. Edmund Burke, who's widely regarded as the father of modern political conservatism, in the English tradition, which is another complicating factor that I'll touch on in a minute, Burke explained that prudence, rather than devotion to abstract principle, is actually the mark of a good government. So it's not to say that there aren't such things as conservative principles, or principles that we can call conservative. There are, and we'll talk about them in a minute or so. But it is to say that society is a living organism, constantly changing both in its own right and in response to the myriad forces, good and bad, that it and its constituent parts come in contact with. And so instead of forcing society to adhere to abstract principles, a prudent government will attempt to adapt principles, enduring principles, to new circumstances and allow those changes to occur, but managing change in such a way as to preserve the society's essential character while preventing the sort of turmoil and strife that often accompanies such changing. Another complicating factor in defining conservatism is the difference between what I call conservatism in the English tradition and the reactionary anti-liberal political movement of continental Europe that emerged in the middle of the 19th century. Both movements sought to preserve their respective societies' traditional composition and character. The English tradition, however, was one of individual liberty and a political system dedicated to its protection, while the continental tradition was more of one of preserving a society that was ruled by absolute monarchy. So in this context, actually, just as a little aside, the French Revolution, at least at its start, would have been more or less a liberal event, but the American Revolution was in fact a deeply conservative event, in that the colonists were simply trying to restore the liberties that they had inherited as free Englishmen. That's a little bit of an aside, and just one of those little interesting ironies in the subject. I don't want to talk for too long. I said that there are a number of principles of government that I consider to be conservative in nature. Let me just run through a couple of these very quickly. The first I'd say is and probably the most important, is that of limited government. And I refer here to government being the state. Limited government, whose chief role is to preserve and protect the security of the nation and the liberty of its citizens, and to provide a unified framework within which men and women can associate and interact with one another both socially and economically to everyone's benefit according to their own judgment. That's part one. Part two, and I think that this is one of the things that separates us conservatives from libertarians, theoretically anyway. In practice, I actually think, Karen, she says I am a libertarian now. Actually, in practice, Karen will probably agree that in a lot of ways there's a lot of similarity and overlap in what we believe in. But I would say that true conservatives believe that, in sort of a part two, believe that a free society requires a mature, responsible, caring, or to use another word that's out there, a virtuous citizenry. And we believe that citizens of this nature don't emerge by accident. They're shaped with intent, primarily by parents within the family unit, but also by their communities. So conservatives acknowledge the irreplaceable, and I would argue autonomous role played by the family in a free society, as well as the role of, brace yourselves, the church, and I use that term in a very, very broad context. As the church is sort of the chief source of ideas like charity, fidelity, and other moral teachings that I think are very important to being a good citizen. Edmund Burke talked about this, how people could only be free to the extent that they were able to govern over themselves as individuals. George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, also talked about the importance of having a more or less religious society. Now, I want to stress that I don't accept the proposition that some conservatives advance that the state should play the role of church in determining what is morally correct and imposing it on people. This isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying that the state has its own role that it has to play, and that other units or other institutions within civil society, like the family and like the church, again, broadly speaking, that these play important autonomous roles as well, and that each has to respect one another's role, and each has to, at a minimum, not work to undermine the role and the authority of the other. So anyway, I love talking. And this is the first time I've had a chance to speak where my throat actually has not been that bad. So I could go on for half an hour, but I suspect that then I will get cut off. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say, and have a nice debate.
Okay. I actually disagree with Joseph. I don't think that, well, that's surprising. I don't think that the word conservatism actually has any specific fixed content. I think that it rather refers to a mindset or a way of approaching politics or political policy. So, for instance, back when the Soviet Union was breaking up, and there were people who still wanted old-style communism, I think that it was quite correct to refer to those people as conservatives, because in their context they were. What they wanted to do was prevent change or go back to something that had just happened previously, go back to what the situation had been in a previous, close previous era. So I think that that's what conservatism means. I don't think that it has any particular policy content, and so I don't like to, well, I certainly never describe myself as a conservative. For today's conservatives that, here in Canada, I always have to ask, what is it that you're trying to conserve, or what is it that you want to go back to? Because over the past 100 years in Canada, we've had such drastic changes. If you look back 100 years ago, what we had then, that someone then might have wanted to conserve is very different from the very mixed economy and half socialized world and regulated, extremely regulated society that we have now. So that's essentially what I think of conservatism. And I want to just use a little prop here that I brought to show you something that I think is actually a little more illuminating than the term conservative. Towards the end of the film there, they started referring to, I guess it was George Will that started referring to Goldwater as being libertarian. So I just want to show you this little graph thing that, very simple prop, right? In about 1969, a US guy named David Nolan said, the left-right political spectrum that we talk about is really, really unilluminating. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about being on the left and being on the right, because those terms are almost as vague as conservatism and unfortunately as changing as the word liberalism. So he said, instead of a single-dimensional political spectrum, let's do up a two-dimensional graph. So we've got a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. And he says on one axis we will plot economic freedom. So say you choose the bottom axis as economic freedom, so that people who believe in freedom are on this end out here, and people who believe in state control on economic issues are down here. So things like the level of taxation. If you believe in very little taxes, if you believe in very little regulation of the economy, you're out at this end of the bottom axis. And then on this axis, we plot things like, we plot social issues, which are things like how much control the government should have over issues of sexuality, freedom of speech. Do you believe in gun control? Would you legalize marijuana? All that sort of thing. And to the extent that you believe in freedom, you're up at this end of this axis. And to the extent that you believe in government control, you're down here. So people who believe, as Goldwater demonstrated he did, in very little government interference in the economy and very little interference in social issues, they're up in this corner of the graph. And this is where people who call themselves libertarians would put themselves on this graph. Conservatives are sort of all over the place. A lot of them believe in economic freedom, but not a lot of social freedom, and that's what that phenomenon that they were referring to that started with the Reagan years. So they would be sort of down in this corner of the graph. And you can plot various other political labels that way. But the one thing I do want to stress is that, in my view, libertarianism, in any event, is strictly a political label. That is, it should be confined only to political issues. And political issues have to do with things like, what should the state do to us? What is permissible for the state to do to us? Or what should we expect the state to do for us? And it doesn't have a lot to do with, it shouldn't have anything to do with our religion, whether we believe in divine revelation or not. That is, there can be people who are libertarians who agree on these policy issues, who are both some who are atheists and some who are very religious, and yet they both agree that when it comes to the question of what should the state do to us, or what should the state do for us, we are in the same place, saying that the state should do almost nothing for us, and the state should do almost nothing to us. People should be free to be responsible for their own economic and moral well-being, and they shouldn't be governed by the state. So, in my view, it's important to stick to the philosophical area of politics, which is what is the relationship between the individual and the state, and not get confused by sort of package deal philosophies where people want to throw in, do we believe in divine revelation? Do we believe in a God and all that sort of stuff?
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I was delighted to be invited because I was convinced we would have some very interesting disagreements up here at the panel, not sterile quarrels, but something much more productive. And to begin with, I semi-agree with much of what has been said. Joseph made a point, which is a very reputable conservative category, that conservatism doesn't reduce easily to a single sentence or a few hard propositions, Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke being two notable exponents. And if that's the case, then reducing it to 4 words would be glib and shallow, which is my specialty here. So let me offer a definition that conservatism is metaphysical sanity. That a conservative, at bottom, does not demand more of the universe than it can and will give. I used to make the argument that conservatism, the full-blown version, the complete orchestra, needed to have strong national defense, free market economics, and traditional social values. And although I think that those are the components of complete conservatism, and I think it's why when libertarians talk and conservatives talk, we actually understand each other in a way we may not do to people from different traditions. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily ready to start sharing an apartment. But there's the other thing, is, I think, about conservatism, and it underlies the others, the belief in an objective moral order. That right and wrong exist independently of our wishes about them or our understanding of them. And that this is where the other things come from. That a conservative, therefore, does not think that we can be safe without weapons, that we can be prosperous without prudence, or that we can be virtuous without discipline. Because none of these things are in the moral structure of the universe, and we can't get them out. I think I wanted to make a few points about what conservatism is not. Conservatism, for instance, is not vulgar. I was once in a cafeteria lineup with a Reform MP when I worked for the party, and I realized with horror that I was about to order a shrimp and avocado sandwich and a latte, and I thought I better let him get through the line before I placed that order, lest I should inspire contempt or worse. But the fact that you have people at a Free Kick Film Festival who at least want to come to this discussion means conservatives are not against art. Some conservatives may like Tim Hortons, donuts, and coffee better than anything else. Others may like organic Chilean wine. But conservatism doesn't just mean you're okay. Conservatism also doesn't mean you're stupid. John Stuart Mill once got himself in a world of hurt because he said that most stupid people were conservatives and was accused of having said most conservatives were stupid people. Whatever conservatism is, it's not just stupidity. It's not meanness. There's a natural tendency on some people's part. If we say you cannot get that from the universe, we're thought we're killjoys, we're spoilsports. We could have visualized world peace, and you're clouding our image because we say it doesn't work that way. And conservatism is also not immobile. The idea that the people who wanted to keep communism after it failed were conservative, I think, was just a bad use of terminology. Historically, conservatives wanted to conserve a belief in a real moral order against liberals who thought that man could rewrite the rules, and therefore they got pegged as having not wanted change. But that, I think, is just wrong. You know, I think it was Burke who talked about a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. Lincoln said that we should stick to the old and tried against the new and untried. It's important not just old and new, but tried and untried. Conservatives don't think we're going to stumble on something suddenly. Hey, I found a whole new way to run world affairs. Nobody in 3,000 years was smart enough to see it, but I saw it. I was by myself when I saw it. Hey, it's all so simple. That sort of talk is gibberish. You have to do things that have worked, not things that are completely speculative. And that's certainly part of the conservative sentiment. And I also, can't get out of this without quoting Chesterton, that every genuine act of rebellion is also an act of repentance. And I think that's a very conservative sentiment, that we've asked for more from the universe than you can get out of it, and we stop doing that. And my thing about libertarians, Karen said no one's ever called her conservative. I certainly haven't, and I don't think I'm about to. I agree with almost everything libertarians propose. I think their analysis of the state is very good, and most of what they say we ought to do or mostly not do is true. But I don't think it will do what they think it will do. I don't think they will make us taller or better looking or eternally youthful or any of that stuff, because the universe doesn't let us have that. Samuel Johnson had that famous little thing about how small of all that human hearts endure, that part which laws or kings can cause or cure. Conservatism is not a political doctrine, though it has political implications. It's a metaphysical doctrine that says the universe is what it is, whether we like it or not, and we cannot remake things with our minds, again, Chesterton, as though we were witches. So in that sense, I think conservatism is metaphysical sanity. And everything else about it, all the policy prescriptions and attitudes that do or don't belong, come out of that.
Well, I'm the odd man out here, only because I've never identified as a conservative. I've never been accused of being a conservative. I think the role that I'm intended to play here is that of the sort of resident Bolshevik. The in-house Bolshevik. Or Menshevik would probably be more accurate, but there's a peculiar thing that's happened over the last 20 years that has put those of us who considered ourselves to be people of the left in the same kind of room, at this kind of room, with people that we have been obliged to understand as people to our right and conservatives, and yet there's a civil conversation that's possible. And I think there's a number of things that Joseph and Karen and John have said that I agree with. It's very interesting. But you can also roll it back a little bit. John talked about conservatism as understanding that the universe is what it is objectively, or something like that. This is actually a Marxist proposition as well. Joseph talked about how, or at least what I took from what Joseph said, it used to be actually very easy to understand what we meant when we used the term conservative. It used to be very easy to understand what we meant when we used the term liberal and socialist as well. That's actually no longer true. And I'm very much with Karen in her proposition, if I can put it this way, that these categories are contingent. I agree with Karen that the proper way to have understood the Stalinists in the declining days of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was that they were conservatives. To situate myself, I've never really worried too much about it, because the truth of it is I don't have any deep ideological commitments. I'm a writer. I engage sometimes in some polemics. I've found myself doing that a lot, quite reluctantly, in the last few years. But particularly, I think, if we can situate very briefly the last 2 decades into 2 sorts of periods. The 1990s was the shadow of the collapse of state socialism, totalitarian socialism, as any kind of a useful alternative model to the often savage aspects of capitalism. That was not going to work. That was gone. I think the left became utterly unmoored as a consequence of this, interestingly. And then the shadow of September 11th, 2001, which more or less began the decade that's now concluding, in which I believe that the left became more than just unmoored. And there were a lot of people on the left, conventionally, who tried to sort this out. Very interesting group of people. If I have any ideological commitment at all, it's to a school of thought that emerged from something called the Euston Manifesto, which was put together about 4 or 5 years ago by socialists in Britain, classic Blairites, liberals, who said, well, what do we believe? We've argued about and disagreed with one another about the invasion of Iraq. We're confused about Afghanistan. Let's stop arguing with one another and see if we can articulate what we believe. So the result was this thing that has been unhelpfully described as the Euston Manifesto. One of the principles of the Euston Manifesto is a very clear, actually, re-articulation of vaguely left-wing but liberal principles. Two things that made it particularly contentious and problematic was an acknowledgement that we have enemies on our left. We have enemies to the left of us. And that it is necessary, important, useful, and constructive to reach out to people to the right of us, to see if we can begin a new conversation, to see if we can articulate a new politics. One that is not anti-Zionist, one that is not reflexively, culturally relativist, one that is grounded in the objective reality of the world. And I think we're all still sort of muddling through that process now, and I really thank everyone here for allowing me to be the token mentor, and I thank Fred as well for everything he's done.
Well, thank you. Just a question for the other panelists. Terry talked about a new politics and some of the problems on the left. What are your thoughts about a new politics, and how can the right work with people like Terry to achieve something? Is there a new politics?
Well, I'm a bit of a no new thing under the sun reaction to that. Liberalism certainly was not always unmoored, and I don't think liberals should be unmoored. But utopianism has always been unmoored, and somehow following the logic of the project of the left led it into very deep water. And I think of it in a sense this way, that there was this utopian streak in liberalism that said, man does not fulfill his potential because of the restrictions of feudalism. Let's get rid of them in this aggressive classical linear program. And they got rid of them, but it didn't work. And then they said, man does not fulfill his potential because of material insecurity. Let us create a welfare state. And they did a pretty good job of creating a welfare state. They created the political climate for it. They brought in the institutions. It didn't work out very well fiscally, but it also didn't let man free. Man was still in chains. And then they thought maybe it's social and with a strong dose of sexual. We must somehow free people from social and sexual conventions so that they may truly begin to live. And again, they accomplished a great deal of the program on paper, but they didn't get the metaphysical payoff. And the trouble with things like the Euston Manifesto is we could have a policy that's a lot less harebrained if we follow this document. But what is it that we're trying to, where's the end of all of this? What is the society that will result if we somehow make these things work this time? And either in the end, I think you admit to yourself that we cannot resolve the human condition, or you unmoor. I don't think there's a third way.
No third way. Joseph? No, no third way.
No third way? I don't think there's a third way. By the way, Terry, I don't know if you noticed, but when Karen mentioned about, you know, the Bolsheviks and that from the old Soviet Union were conservatives, I think that in a roundabout way she actually was accusing you of being conservative. and you know, can I just say something on that subject? I want to point out that John has provided I think a really neat sort of universal, I don't want to use the word definition, but a context to understand the term conservatism in more of a universal fashion. I'm much more practical when it comes to it, and I think I want to stress that when I talk about being a conservative, and I refer to it being more in the English tradition, it's because I actually agree with Karen to the degree that conservatism has an element of preservation of something in the past. I think you can make the argument that a lot of the, I hate the term right-wing, left-wing, wings are for turkeys, but to the degree that we sort of understand what we're talking about when we use those terms, some of the right-wing reactionary movements that have emerged in continental Europe, particularly over a period of time, that to the degree that they were trying to preserve something that pre-existed, I agree that it's probably accurate to say that they've had a conservative element to them, or they could call themselves conservatives. And generally they are described as being conservative, but very different from the type of conservatism I'm talking about. I'm not talking about it as an abstract political philosophy. I'm talking about preserving a social and political structure that has been, over a period of time, measured not in a few decades or even a few centuries, but going back to hundreds and hundreds of years to Magna Carta and even beyond that, that encompasses the seminal events in the conception and the birth and the coming of age of parliamentary democracy. To me, and all of this was about preserving individual liberty. And yes, in the development, if you follow the history, there were times, of course, when things went off track, okay? But as a general rule, this is the type of structure that I'm interested in preserving. I also want to make one small comment about the religious aspect of it, because my friend Karen mentioned a couple of times used the word creationism. And I was very careful not to get into using theological terminology, because I don't believe that there's any place for theological any kind of promotion of any particular theology anywhere within government at all. But I do believe that notwithstanding theology, that religion in particular, and I'm speaking now as an Orthodox Jew, who has a lot of respect and admiration for the role that Christianity over time has played in the emergence of a responsible, virtuous citizenry, and the importance of that citizenry to the preservation of a free society, the emergence of a free society. I think that you have to respect that role. And when libertarians, or people that identify themselves as libertarians, I'm not necessarily referring to you in this respect, Karen, because I know you get it, some people don't. When libertarians talk about no religion, really what they're saying is that we're going to use the state as a blunt instrument against religion. I'm not talking about the state playing the role of church. I'm talking about the state getting out of a real separation of church and state, where the church is then left to expound moral propositions and to say, you know, it's not right for society or for people in society to practice this type of behavior or this type of behavior. And people can accept it or not accept it, but that should be part of the public and civil discourse. And we find ourselves in a country like Canada today, for instance, where more and more you can't have those conversations because the state has taken on the role of moral arbiter at the same time that it's denying that case. But I want to stress, we're not talking about whether or not we're going to be teaching creationism in school or anything like that. That's not what I'm referring to. Sorry, that was a bit much more of a mouthful than you asked me, but I figured what the heck I had the mic, so.
comments, Karen? You want to...
Well, yeah, I'll go back to Terry's point and just say this is sort of one of the enduring debates in my household, which is unusual because we don't usually have a whole lot of debate in my household. We usually agree on everything, but I sort of hang out with conservatives, even though I don't call myself one and I'm not one, because I think that's, first of all, they're the only people that really want to listen to libertarians. There's a wide streak of libertarianism in the conservative movement, and I always figure it's because conservatives find libertarianism really sexy, but they just can't sort of bring themselves to adopt it. My husband, on the other hand, maintains that if we're ever really going to have any real change in this country, that libertarians have to start talking to liberals, and in particular the people in the Liberal Party. I don't agree with that, but I can certainly see, you know, I mean, there are certain conservatives when I talk to them that on, you know, social issues that I can certainly see that we will never make any progress there. And he may be right that on certain social issues, obviously, you're going to make more headway with the left, but then, you know, with the liberals. But the liberals are so absolutely out to lunch on economic issues that yeah, it seems like there's not going to be a lot of change to me brought about that way either.
So we're running out of time. One question: what do you make of the current conservative movement in Canada? We've got a government that just blocked the takeover of potash in Saskatchewan. It's cancelled the census. It's done a whole variety of things, many of which some people claim are not true to conservative principles. What's happened with the conservative movement in Canada? Anybody want to?
There's a conservative movement in Canada?
We have a lot of conservative governments, so supposedly.
Well, don't make the mistake of brace yourselves, because I'm looking in the audience and I see that there are people who have some connection with conservative government. So take this as it's meant. It's a constructive criticism. Please do not equate conservative government, the big C conservative, with conservative as a political philosophy, okay? There is an element of conservatism. There is an element of conservatism within the political party, the Conservative Party, and it tends to lean in that direction. But I think that most real conservatives who are involved in an incipient conservative movement, or trying to help to build a conservative movement in Canada, I think would say that there's a lot of things that they don't really get right from that perspective. And that may not be such a bad thing, because government is government. You have to govern within the reality of the constraints that you operate under, and not just if it's a minority. On the specific question of the state of Canada's conservative movement, it's there. I like to say that we're sort of where these guys were in the film, probably in the early 1960s, if I was to compare the two. There's a lot of desire to be doing things. There are a lot of organizations that are popping up from the grassroots and elsewhere. So I'm actually quite hopeful for the future of conservatism in Canada, but there's an awful long way to go. An awful long way to go.
Anybody else, Karen?
Yeah, just, I mean, if you go with my definition of conservatism, which means, you know, resisting change and not wanting to change, then the conservatives in power today are really being very conservative because they're being liberals. They're just doing whatever the Liberal Party used to do. I think they're being quite consistent with my definition of conservative.
When I look at that question, I think again about that idea of no rebellion without repentance. I don't think most conservative regimes in Canada, partisan conservative, were inspired by a feeling of repentance about the way they'd approached public issues when they ran for office and won. But I also think it comes back in some respect to the electorate. You know, I want to say, never mind the conservative movement, what's happened to Parliament? What's happened to our understanding of legislators as watchdogs on the executive? What do we as voters ask for from the people that we elect that causes them to behave in the ways that they behave? Good and honorable men and women, filled with decent impulses, often grounded in the principles that many of us believe in when they go into politics, and then they govern like this. And this is because of where the votes are and how the mechanics of it all works. And then to make a gigantic leap, I was thinking of Joseph and his centuries there, in some sense, I would like to start a conservative movement in Canada by saying we need a statue on Parliament Hill of Edward Cook, and we need to know who he was and why he matters, and we need a statue on Parliament of Alfred the Great. And we need to make the legislators walk past Alfred the Great every day and remember that this is where our ordered political community of responsible freedom and decency to one another comes from, is the King of Wessex in the Dark Ages. And that this is the tradition we've inherited. And this is the thing that men and women have fought and died for over hundreds and hundreds of years so that we could have the kind of society that is free in an enduring way. And once you get that, maybe the party platforms start to be more relevant to the kind of renovation that I think our political system needs. But it's got to come from us because we vote.